All right, English 101. As I said in the last set of slides, let me see if I can pull this up. I want to talk about intros in particular, and really not so much the whole intro paragraph as the first sentence or two of the intro paragraph, the hook in particular. I think it's just a crucial part of your paper. There's an old grandpa saying that says, "Well begun is half done." So remember, the intro has three parts. It has the hook or the grabber, then it gives background, and that funnels the reader down into your thesis statement. But we're going to focus on those very first couple of lines of your essay. So remember that an intro is basically your first impression with the reader. And we all know that within just microseconds, our gut tells us something about a person that we meet for the first time. That same kind of things happens when your reader picks up your essay for the first time. It includes the title, it includes paper format, but it really starts when people read the very first ideas that you put out on the page. So remember that I'm reading it along with 75 other papers. You don't want it to sound like everyone else's intro and be boring and just lay there flat on the page. You want the teacher to go from this position to this position. You want me to lean forward and get interested. There's a kind of a sales technique. They call it a yes roll. So you want, if you're selling something, you want to get your customer going like this. Yep, yep, yep. So that we're following along and saying yes. As I said, this is kind of like sales. The reason we call it a hook is it's a grabber. But if you think about fishing, it's the kind of thing where if you feel a tug on the end of your line, you want to pull back on that fishing pole. Those of you who have been fishing. And that sets the hook deep in the jaw, and then you can kind of reel the reader through the rest of your paper, through the jaw of the fish, I should say. That's the metaphor that we're talking about. In a second, I'll tell you a story about Sugar Ray Leonard, but he's a good example of how important intros and conclusions are. A famous boxer from the 1970s, 80s, and I guess a little bit maybe of the 90s. It's often a good idea to write your intro last, as I mentioned in the last set of slides. Once we know everything that's in our body paragraphs, we can kind of tailor or custom make our intro to fit what we've said. So here's a quick story about Sugar Ray Leonard. This is not Sugar Ray Leonard. In fact, this is a guy named Marvelous Marvin Hagler. And as you can say, he's a big, intimidating figure. He's got just this, he's built out of, looks like stone, and a serious guy. And he was the champ of the middleweight division, I think, for a long time in the 90s and maybe even in the 80s. The guy that he fought for the championship is this guy. This is Sugar Ray Leonard. And as you can see, he's a different character. He's an Olympic gold medalist in the 1970s. He smiled a lot and was charming. He liked to goof around in the ring quite a bit. And was a kind of an American icon for a while when I was growing up. He did TV commercials for 7-Up that were really famous. And this goes back before Marvelous Marvin Hagler, the guy we saw on the last screen. So Sugar Ray Leonard quit boxing after defeating everybody basically that he could beat and retired. He'd made enough money. He decided he wanted to sit on the beach and enjoy his kids. But in the 5 years after he retired, this guy came to dominate and beat everybody. So much so that there was no one left for him to box either. So they called Sugar Ray Leonard up and they asked if he wanted to box Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Now, coming back after 5 years of sitting means he had some serious ring rust. So he had to come up with strategies for how he could beat Marvelous Marvin Hagler. And he did. The amazing way that he beat him was using strong intros and conclusions. And I usually tell a 10-minute story about this whole thing, but I'll kind of cut to the chase here so that you can figure out how this little guy, beat this big guy after this little guy had 5 years off and wasn't really ready to go toe to toe. What he did instead was this. Sugar Ray won during the last 30 seconds of each round. This is from his biography. Launching an onslaught of punches right in front of the scorer's table. He did it at the start of every round as well. That's the intro to every round. In his autobiography, he admits to throwing as many flurries as possible in hopes of leaving the judges with a positive impression that might help me secure the round, he said. In interviews before the fight, Lewis said he was said on more than one occasion he was going to steal rounds, and that's what boxers call it, and win over the crowd. He apparently won over the judges too. So stealing rounds is where you go out and have a big showy display of punches at the start and a big showy display of punches at the end. And the judges remember that part, not the part where Sugar Ray Leonard ran around and hardly made any contact, and not even whether he hit Marvelous Marvin Hagler very hard. It was that there was a big show right at the start, something sparkly right at the start. So for us, one way to kill that spark is to start with something like a definition. So a bad hook would be where you just start out with a dictionary definition. I think of this as kind of a middle school style of grabbing the reader's attention. Here's an example. Webster's Dictionary. According to Webster's Dictionary, racism is defined as a belief that race is a primary determinant of human, and it's just boring. In fact, teachers have a phrase for this. They call it definitionitis. So don't start with a definition. Instead, here are some better techniques. Start instead with something like a question. So when you ask a question, this is an easy one, by the way, to do if you're struggling for something. It can be overdone. In fact, most times for Essay 1, people overuse this style. But if you have a really good question, it doesn't matter if it's overused. What would you do if you were spit on, called terrible names, and arrested for trying to eat lunch with your friend or for trying to vote? Now that grabs our attention right away because the reader wants to answer that and puts themselves in that situation. Another style of intro, and some of these can be combined. So you might start with a question and then go from broad to narrow. Remember that funnel? Well, you can't really see a funnel shape there. I'll give you a better example of it here. This is the Louvre Museum in Paris. This glass and steel structure outside has been added in the 1980s. This is a 17th or 15th or 16th century palace in the middle of Paris. That's now where the Mona Lisa is and many other famous works of art. And underneath that glass and steel structure right there is this kind of funnel shape, this what they call reverse pyramid that goes from broad to narrow. Wait, I'm not sure you can see that very well. That's right. Mr. Peters is making you look at his vacation pictures. I made my family go back and take this picture so I could do this one right here. So think of that shape of that structure right there, from broad down to this tip, where you give a kind of it's sometimes called the Dawn of Man intro, where you go back and you give a lot of background information and lead straight down into your thesis. So you really do funnel them with some history. I'll let you read this, pause it maybe if you want to, and read my example right there. I don't want to read the whole thing. It might kind of slow you down on these slides. Okay, if you paused it, now we can move forward to the next style of grabbing the reader's attention, and we'll call this one relevance. And relevance is where we really take the idea that people are mainly interested in things that affect them. And we try and think of how we can point at the reader and say, this will help you, or you should care about this. Sometimes it's called the so what, who cares question, which we'll cover a little bit more in English 102. But how will this affect me personally? So, for instance, why should you be concerned about race? Well, as Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That means if racism is allowed to live in your home, city, country, then your own rights are at stake. So I've said you and your 3 times in this first couple of sentences. That way the person reading this leans forward because it relates to them directly. I'm not going to tell the story about Professor Beavis, but hopefully if I have you for English 102 and we're face-to-face, I'll go into more detail about that anecdote. Another style that I think may be my favorite is to open with a short story or an anecdote that's related to your theme. I've got a long story about a friend and I who encountered a racist at 4th of July weekend at a place called Crescent Lake. I'm not going to tell that story right now, but the punchline of that story is my friend told someone not to use the N-word in the middle of the night after people had been drinking. This guy that we'd met kept using the N-word, and my friend didn't say anything the first time he said it, and the second time he said it, my friend stepped forward and said, I don't like that kind of language. So that story, a vivid example, and I could paint the picture of the 4th of July weekend and this cabin we were in and how people, had been joking back and forth and how it came to a sudden stop. That might be a good way to grab the reader's attention right away, to talk about race and our reaction to race. As I showed you earlier, there's that great Martin Luther King quote from Letter from Birmingham Jail, and that's another way to start your essay. And again, you can mix and match these like I did with relevance in the quote. But you might, find a good quote from anywhere, from a famous author or somebody that's a friend of yours, or maybe something from John Lewis's book or from Martin Luther King's letters or writing. That's probably John Lewis's most famous quote there. And quotes are great to start the paper because oftentimes people say things in ways that are just so perfect that you couldn't say them the same way. So that it gives you somebody else's authority. I guess it's a way to establish ethos as well. A surprising fact or a statistic can be a nice way to open up the paper. And I think the reason this works is that you then come off as somebody who has something to tell the reader that they didn't know before. So I'll let you pause and look at this as well, about statistics about incarceration for people of color and how that's kind of shocking in some ways. I'll let you pause. Okay, if you've unpaused, that statistic should grab our attention and make us realize this person who's going to write this essay may have more important information to share with me that I didn't know as I read. The last style, and this is kind of a poetic way of doing things, it's a literary term, metaphors or similes, would be to open with comparing two things to each other that are dissimilar. So privilege, which is a term that I know is really loaded, like white privilege or male privilege, or cisgender privilege is another one that we talk about. It's economic privilege. The person who wrote that original paper about white privilege called it an invisible knapsack, something we carry around on our backs that we can't see, but yet we still have with us. So that's a metaphor. Privilege is like an invisible knapsack. And you can see here's a powerful metaphor about lynching from the South, from the singer Billie Holiday, from a famous song called Strange Fruit. And I'll let you read that if you want to pause right now and read those lyrics. Okay, if you're unpaused, you can see how powerful those metaphors can be. And I think part because, like an anecdote, they paint a picture that's a memorable image in our head. I'm going to end with now some thoughts or notes on conclusions. As I mentioned in the last set of slides, the big thing is there's a few things to avoid, like in conclusion or in summary or in closing. Those come across as a little too basic, I guess you might say. And of course, don't save your thesis for your conclusion. You want to say bottom line up front what your paper is going to be about. I'm going to kind of skip over a couple of things. Make sure that if you use your thesis statement that you substantively change it, that you don't just restate exactly. If you're taking a standardized test, maybe that's okay. But you really don't want to just have your thesis statement repeated. You want to try and rephrase it in a lot of ways. Instead, as I mentioned before, bring it full circle. So if there's something that you said in the intro, refer back to it in the conclusion. Use your hook to power your conclusion. In fact, all of those techniques, quotes, anecdotes, questions, all those techniques that work in the intro also work in the conclusion. As I said before, don't just add up everything that you've said in your intro, in your body paragraphs, but try and add a little bit of bringing it all together in the conclusion. That's the synthesis of everything that you've said. You might want to think about proposing a course of action. Maybe that would work for this essay. I could think of ways that it might. What do we do with this information? Should we call our congressman? Should we vote for change? Should we register to vote? Should we protest for what we believe in? So a call to action might be a way to charge your conclusion with something memorable. And then reverse the pyramid. So as we went from the very broad down to the very narrow, start with the very narrow, John Lewis, and back it up and say, what does this mean for America today? Maybe update us to where we are in 2020 from the 1960s. So work backwards from that date to where we are and say how that civil rights movement or John Lewis's life echoes down to today. Finally, and I like doing this as well, sometimes you'll find a great couple of quotes, maybe one for your intro, or maybe you want to put some quote that just wraps everything up. Maybe it's something that Martin Luther King said in Letter from Birmingham Jail. You want to wrap it up with some really powerful quote, or maybe a statistic or an insight that you have. Hang on to that, put it in your back pocket, as they say, and bring it out for a kind of a dessert, big finish, clincher, they call it in public speaking. And I think that's it for my slides. Hopefully this will help where you write your intro paragraph and focus on the hook of that intro paragraph. Remember, there's 3 parts to the intro. The one we just covered was hook, but there's also background and then your thesis statement. All right, good luck today and nice job this week.